In today's video, I want to give my reaction to Donald Trump's immigration address on TV last night. And I want to talk specifically about how personality type helps explain why the speech was not compelling, why it didn't really resonate, and why it didn't achieve his policy aims. So I was watching the speech very carefully because I had some money in the prediction markets. I was betting basically on whether or not Trump would mention certain things in the speech, like national emergency and Schumer and whatever else. So I was watching very carefully for the words that Trump would use, but I was struck more than anything that my immediate reaction, even though I'm not a very visual person, I'm more verbal in nature. I was struck by how jilted and awkward Trump sounded. And it reminded me that when I was on the campaign, I remember soon after I joined the Trump campaign, Trump went to the Mayflower Hotel where he gave a speech on foreign policy to the Center for the National Interest. And I remember that this speech was basically the byproduct of the fact that Trump had gone through the primaries and he kept getting hammered over and over again by the Washington press corps and the policy establishment. People kept asking him, like, who are your foreign policy advisors? Who are you talking to? And so finally, after a lot of harassment, Trump basically decided to go and give a prepared foreign policy speech in the way a quote-unquote presidential candidate would do. And I remember that after watching Trump give very compelling, interesting appearances at rallies and off-the-cuff sort of events, he shows up at the Mayflower Hotel. He was really stiff, really awkward. It was just a cringeworthy performance. And I remember after I left the campaign, I talked to Evan Osnos about this for a piece he was doing in the New Yorker. And I told him that I knew right away when I saw that whole fiasco at the Mayflower Hotel and Trump's body language and so forth, I knew, one, that this would not be a conventional campaign by any means, and two, I knew that the policy advisors around Trump, the policy team, would basically be irrelevant because this wasn't a man who was in the least bit interested in conventional policy advice and that whole process. And that was borne out by the fact later on, as we found that whenever Trump would want foreign policy advice or whatever, he had particular contempt for these policy intellectuals and think tankers and professors who normally advise a candidate on policy. He preferred to go to the generals, go to military people. Now, so what's going on here? And I think there are a lot of ways to explain this, but when I saw the speech and how awkward it was and how Trump just wasn't invested in it, how he looked a little bit sullen, my gut reaction here it has been borne out by the reporting that we're seeing today in the press today. So, like, right after Trump gave his speech, Maggie Haberman, who is well connected in the Trump administration, I think Trump basically talks to her. She immediately went on CNN and talked about how Trump thought the whole thing was pointless, how he didn't want to do it. And then Peter Baker here in the New York Times, also well connected, says here that I'll read here that after spending much of the first 2 weeks of the shutdown cloistered in the White House, he has now opted to use the powers of the presidency to focus public attention on his ominous warnings about the border. Yet privately, Mr. Trump dismissed his own new strategy as pointless. In an off-the-record lunch with television anchors hours before the address, he made clear in blunt terms that he was not inclined to give the speech or go to Texas, but was advised into it by advisors. Okay, so what's going on here? I think a big part of what's going on is the fact that we have an enormous gulf, an enormous disjuncture between Trump's personality type And the vast majority of people who are in the White House, in policy positions, in the media, in the space of Washington / policy establishment and apparatus. So the personality website, Kiersey, which is a temperament methodology based off of the Myers-Briggs system, they type Donald Trump correctly, in my view, as a ESTP, an extroverted, sensing, thinking perceiver. So the way some of the words that describe a ESTP, these are also known as the artisan promoters. Artisan being people who have the SP combination, the sensor perceivers, and then the ESTPs in particular are known as promoters. And so some of the qualities that tend to capture their persona, their essence, is that they're magnetic, they're present, like more in the moment, they're unpredictable, they're risk-taking, proactive, and they're tactical. So now so you can see why Trump is so compelling in these live forums and these major crowds where he has the attention on television in unscripted ways, that it plays to his dynamism, his off-the-cuff commentary. He sense the crowd, sense the emotions. But where his weaknesses come is that he, like most ESTPs, he has a harder time with concepts, with strategy, with scripted remarks. And so one of the problems here is not that the ESTP personality is any better or worse, but the reality is that the vast majority of people who make it in Washington as professionals in politics, as professionals in the policy apparatus, far from being ESTPs, actually tend to come from personality types that are the precise opposite of ESTPs. Now, a big part of the reason is the education system. So as I've argued in previous videos, usually what you have is that the K through 12 system tends to be oriented primarily for SJ types. These are the sensor judgers. And I would argue in particular the SFJs, the sensor feeler judgers, just because a lot of the teachers and bureaucrats in the education system are women who are more oriented around emotions and feeling. But then when you get into the higher education system at the college, and especially at the postgraduate level, you usually end up seeing that the intuitives are at an advantage. So the NTs are at an advantage because they're more rational, logical, analytical, and the NFs, the intuitive feelers, have their own advantages because they are intellectual and conceptual, but also they tend to thrive in particular in like the arts and some of the social sciences because they can bring an emotional sensibility to fields like psychology or whatever. And it's really the SPs in particular that get screwed in the educational system, where they're so, like, for example, one of the most common differentiators between an intuitive and a sensor is that the more someone is on the intuitive side of the spectrum, the more inclined they are to read and to learn by reading books and whatever. And then also intuitives tend not to be as like present in the moment. But they tend to be better at forecasting, at thinking about the past, thinking about the future, playing out different scenarios, but they're not as here and now. And so often they're less charismatic and less able to be out in the public. I mean, I've spent more time than I would care to admit analyzing and studying and researching Donald Trump, and I'll say this only with a little bit of sarcasm. Although he's written several books that have all been bestsellers, I mean, the only evidence that I've seen, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the only evidence I've seen that Donald Trump has learned a thing from reading a book is his fascination with Nazi propaganda. I mean, it's a little sick, but I think that's the reality. But what ends up happening is that basically you have a guy like Trump, especially in this political environment dominated by cable news, live media, social media, it very much plays to the strengths of a ESTP. And that's why he took the political world by storm and was so effective on the campaign trail. But the problem is that two things happened. One is that Trump never really, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that he put much attention or care into really preparing for how to govern, how to really wield control of the bureaucracy, how to negotiate with members of Congress, how to actually like move the policy machinery to get things done. And I don't think this is because he's lacking in policy intuition. I actually think, and I've argued all along, that he actually does have a fairly well-considered worldview. But that's not enough for getting policy done. And then his problems are compounded by the fact that because he never put in the care to really surround himself with advisors, with a team of people who really get him, who really understand not only what his policy worldview is, but also what his leadership style is, what his management style is, and how to be responsive to him, that he ended up inheriting a lot of the ordinary policy crowd that would be there for any presidency. Only the problem is that whereas with what you get with conventional politicians, usually by the time they become president, you get the A-team of advisors and experts. Trump didn't even really have that privilege, as I've talked about in other things. The only really clear differentiator between the people who joined Trump and have been loyal to him and those who haven't is the fact that they're disproportionately just B-team people. These are just mediocre people who have a chip on their shoulder about not being included in from sort of more well-known experts, and they saw their opportunity to get in early with a candidate who had a void of advisors, and in some sense to basically get over-promoted. So now, not only does he have a group of people who are not particularly talented, but now he also has people who nevertheless come from a conventional background. So these are people who usually got there into these jobs by going to a decent college or graduate school. They might work at a think tank. They might work in some kind of a writing intensive or research intensive job. A lot of them are obviously lawyers. And this phenomenon is true in spades when it comes to speechwriters. So if you look at the people in Washington who tend to be professional speech makers or speechwriters, what you usually end up seeing is that these, like the very common or typical profile of a Washington speechwriter is someone who's intellectual, very literate, very articulate. They usually go to a top school, usually like a top 5 or 10 undergraduate school. And these are basically people who are also, in addition to being academic and intellectual, they're also well connected with a certain policy crowd. Maybe because they interned at a think tank or whatever else. And so basically these are like the young people who everyone knows are smart, everyone knows are hardworking, but they don't have like the requisite experience usually, or the political foundation or mandate to really hold a senior policy job. And so they usually end up being in a speechwriting job. And then some of these people transition from speechwriting to doing other things, like policy jobs or whatever else, but the people who really stick with the speechwriting thing are really these intellectual types. They're usually people they're almost all intuitives. The men are usually, I would say, INTJ, INTP. The women are often INFJ. Occasionally, maybe you'll get an INFP. You'll also see sometimes ENFPs, ENFJs, ENTJs, but these are all basically intuitives, either the rationals or the intuitives, the NFs. And so you could see like what happens with a speech like the one Trump gave, which is a prepared speech, but also a primetime speech, that in the formulation and crafting of the speech, you usually have a lot of different stakeholders involved. So you'll have, first of all, like someone at the White House will make a determination that they want to give a speech. So this would involve like the communications team, the political team, the policy team, and then maybe the president, but certainly senior people at the White House will talk about what their strategy is, what the messaging will be that they want. And And this will happen, obviously, in conjunction and negotiation with members of Congress, with people at think tanks, with members of the press corps. And then ultimately, it'll be up to the speechwriters to actually write this all down. And then once the speech is written, it'll go around for clearance and feedback. And so at the end of the day, you end up getting this like compromise thing with a very supposedly well thought out strategy with very fancy terms and messaging. The only problem is that if the guy who has to deliver it, it's not his voice, it's not his message, it's not his tone, you end up getting what you got last night from Trump, which is a totally jilted, disoriented, unpersuasive, uncompelling speech that only, in my view, made his policy problem worse. And so, I mean, I don't know if you guys watched the speech or not, but you can look at the transcript, and even when you read the transcript just on paper, without even seeing Trump's awkward delivery, you see the fact that this is not a speech that in any way sounds like him. So Trump, for example, talking about immigration, he says, this is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul. I mean, does anyone think that Donald Trump views the immigration issue as a crisis of the soul, or that he gives one damn about humanitarian considerations? I mean, to be clear, I think Trump does have a very kind of compelling, interesting, well-considered view of immigration and border control. It's not one that I agree with, but it's a serious argument. But it has nothing to do with humanitarian considerations or anything whatsoever about the soul. I mean, this is a guy who's evinced no religiosity, no sense of real higher morality. So I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous, but you can see how a bunch of eggheads in the White House and people with a different personality type, in the case of his communications team, probably more feelers, in the case of the policy intellectuals, probably more of the NTs, how all of them like got together and thought this would be a great idea. Now, I think this also points to a more another prediction I'll make here about the Trump presidency, that it's natural for a new politician who's just staffing up to have to go through some trial and error before they get the right team. I think the Trump phenomenon is interesting because I actually think he had a better set of advisors early on than he's had later in his presidency. So, like Corey Lewandowski, for example, who managed early on his campaign and then ended up getting removed. His big motto all along was "Let Trump be Trump," and I think he wrote a book to that effect. And I think what Corey's basic argument was that Trump is who he is, that there are positives and negatives of it, but on balance, you're better off letting him go out there and be himself. Over time, the closer and closer Trump got to the White House, and then ultimately when he became president, what you've actually seen is that he's been surrounded by and constrained by a group of advisors who, one, do not understand him, seemingly do not even pretend to want to understand him, and three, are, in my view, not even all that loyal to him. They're there for their own ambitions, their own egos. And this is a very dangerous situation for Trump, I think, because we're now at an inflection point here where we're in a border shutdown here, where basically he has a choice now of either having to make a compromise that's going to make his base very angry, or he's going to have to persist here, maybe declare a national emergency and get into a political situation where more and more of the country is going to turn on him. Then you combine this with the fact that the Mueller investigation is now wrapping up, probably is going to release its report any day now. And when you have a White House now in this kind of a political crisis, they're already unpopular, and they now have a White House and an administration more generally that is neither up to the job nor even able to go to bat for Trump and wage a coherent defense. You now have the ingredients for a president who feels isolated, misunderstood, and may lash out. And you also have the ingredients of a staff here and the people who report to him who, one, feel misunderstood, feel ignored, feel like no matter how hard they try, they can't get the president to do what they want. And then they also recognize that the longer that they hang around in this administration, the longer they try, they're just undermining their own reputation, their own career in Washington, their own professional networks, who, if my personality theory is correct, most of their professional acquaintances are probably people of their personality types, the NTs, the NFs, the SJs, who, they're the ones who basically rule and dominate Washington. They have no particular fealty to people like Trump. And what you could end up seeing is a dangerous level of attrition, where you have an understaffed, underappreciated, beleaguered White House and administration now faced with this job of trying to be responsive to a president they don't get, while at the same time dealing with the pressures of a Washington establishment that not only doesn't understand Donald Trump, but wants to bring him down. Okay, so that's all I had here. I guess now that I'm on video here and talking about speech writing, I should I'll take the opportunity to mention that right now I'm working on 2 projects as a speechwriter and a ghostwriter. These are 2 books I'm working on, both on foreign policy, but I'm expecting these to wrap up probably in the next month or 2. So I will have the bandwidth to take on a more involved ghostwriting or speechwriting project. I'd like to do another book. So if that's something that you're interested in working on, or you're interested, just let me know, and we can talk about that. But I hope this helps, and I'll look forward to your feedback and comments. Thanks.